everybody. This week, we're focused on the West and feminist ethics and feminist approaches to ethics. So, your required reading as an undergraduate is Chapter 18 in the Schaefer-Landau text on feminist ethics, as well as the piece by Hild Lindemann, What is Feminist Ethics? And of course, we have two chapters, Chapters 7 and 8, from Richardson's West from Appomattox. If you're a graduate student or you want some more challenging reading or more detailed reading, we have T.J. Jackson Lear's No Place of Grace and Allison Jagger. I think I might be mispronouncing this. Actually, I'm not sure how her last name is pronounced, Jagger or Jagger, the piece called Feminist Ethics on Blackboard. So I think what we're going to do this week is we're just going to start with a kind of very broad overview of thinking about feminist ethics in the history of philosophy. And then we'll go on with some more of our discussion and bring in some of these other pieces that we read and how it relates to this time period. So the first thing I think we want to say is, feminist ethics in terms of contemporary English-speaking, what's called analytic, kind of, burgeoning, critical mass, you might say, around the 80s. And so that's when you have a lot of people that are explicitly doing and trying to do feminist ethics, again, in English-speaking countries in this kind of analytic philosophy, which is the thing I'm most familiar with and which we've largely been reading. But historically, there are examples earlier of people who are engaging in what you might think of as central tenets of feminist ethics. So Plato, for example, Plato certainly had some misogynistic things to say about women and their ability to reason, but he also thought that women could just as easily be the ruler of the public as a man would. You have other people in history. I mean, if you think about in the Greeks, there's Hypatia. There's a feminist journal of feminist philosophy named after this person. This was a woman who was a Greek philosopher that was held in esteem by other Greek philosophers. So clearly, just as a woman, that didn't exclude her from participating, from being very smart, from insightful or wise. Even in the Symposium is a particular dialogue of Plato's, and Socrates very clearly thinks that the most thoughtful person in there is Diotima, who's a woman. So you have some of this examples. Of course, in the 1700s, you have Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, who was, we think of Mary Shelley and Frankenstein. That was her mother, and she wrote a work on, I think it's the Vindication of the Rights of Women. And you have, in the medieval period even, you have Hildegard von Bingen, who was an abbess and who was widely recognized as incredibly insightful, incredibly thoughtful, very intelligent. So, and you have John Stuart Mill, who we know from utilitarianism. He wrote a book called On the Subjugation of Women, and in it he argued that any kind of difference between the intellectual capabilities and moral sensitivity of men and women is entirely due to socialization. If they had the same resources and the same education and the same opportunities, that women could basically do things related to moral quality, related to intelligence just as easily, just as well as men. So it's not like, and of course, we didn't even mention like Simone de Beauvoir and various other figures, right? But while there are these sort of occurrences in history, at least in English-speaking academic philosophy, you don't get this explicit sort of focus on a feminist approach to ethics that is entirely different in many ways than other ethical theory until about the 80s.
And we think, too, the 80s being, especially in academia, if women kind of gain entrance into the academy in the 50s, 60s, and then they're getting PhDs in the 60s, 70s,
yeah,
and sort of the publication of all these, articles and books.
Yeah,
the 80s is that moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think, feminism, quote, starts in 1968 and takes off in the 70s and goes in different directions. So, yeah, the 80s definitely, right? If the 70s, as always said, is for history, it's the dawn of women's history. But then by the mid 80s, it switches to gender history, right? The idea, because it's not necessarily about women, because there are also men, but then that means you're looking at, well, what does feminine mean? What does masculine mean?
Sure. Yeah.
And then it's like, okay, we're not talking about necessarily women's history. We're talking about how does gender operate in history?
Sure.
And so I think, all disciplines kind of go through this the gender turn, right? Mm-hmm. then the rise of, which I guess you would say it's second wave. It's a part of that second wave, second wave feminism. First wave, of course, being in the 1830s, 1840s, coming out of the abolitionist movement.
Yeah.
It comes to a halt largely with Civil War. There's a splintering because of emancipation. So you have a segment of sort of that first wave feminism shifting to white supremacy to gain favor.
Sure.
Right. Yeah. It's sort of why do black men have rights over me now as a white woman?
Yeah.
That splinters the movement. But I think in the game, where that mission where you have Arthur in the cart or in the wagon going through roads, that's the generation that sort of, in terms of the woman's vote for president, at least, gets pushed over the finish line. And that's really what you're driving the wagon for in that game, is that generation.
Suffrage.
For women's suffrage. So
yeah, I think, this is an interesting thing. I'm very bad with dates and timelines and stretches of history. And so sometimes, just like I can't remember if it was last week or a prior week, we were talking about how, think about national holidays. It just seems like Thanksgiving has always been one and Christmas has always been one, but that actually isn't until 1800s or something, right? And so, for me, part of me, unreflectively, when I was younger, I just thought, well, obviously women get a vote and own property and have rights. Obviously, it's just, this is how it is, right? And it's sometimes helpful to remind us that just is, relatively recent in terms of history. So I think it is in 1920 or around there that in the United States, women get the right to vote. I think it's in Jagger. She talks about how in Sweden, the women don't get the right to vote in cantons until even later. And, women in the United States could not open a checking account without the signing of a male figure, either their father or husband or something, until 1974. That's like 50 years ago, basically, right? Which is kind of wild. So even though these things might seem like, they've kind of always been this way, or maybe it does to me, I'm a guy, right? So maybe that's also part of it. It's just, these things, they're not really that far in the past if you take this kind of really long way to think about it. So
and I think when you're looking at the game too, it's the game is a product of of when it was produced. Was it 19?
Yeah, I think so. 2018 or something. I keep forgetting
the date. But and so I don't know if how much criticism came out, because sort of the political climate sphere today, the climate today, with woke and DEI or whatever, but when Red Dead comes out and sort of there's this multicultural gang, a lot of that is based off a perception of the West that was an image generated before any civil rights were extended to people of color or women. And so the reaction to, say, a multicultural Red Dead or anything along those lines is governed by a pattern that was a construction based off, a white nationalist Jim Crow United States during the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and then the 60s is when civil rights, voting rights, housing rights comes in. So there's, again, when I'm playing this game as a historian, all that stuff's happening in my head in terms of, I've seen enough Westerns from the golden age of Hollywood, which is very white. Right. But I also know that that's a construction, right? It wasn't all white people.
Cowboys were black.
And
third
were Latino or Mexican, right?
Yes.
And so those old John Wayne movies are not accurate. Right. And so, but those are also the baseline
for the culture, idea of the West, the cultural idea of the West or whatever.
And that kind of goes back to even The Virginian, right? That novel, I think is 1902. And it's written 3 years after this fictional period. And so you have again, we were talking about this in class, this idea of the West being the mythical ground zero for American identity that's being constructed as it's occurring, right? So the wild Bill Cody, Buffalo Bills, Wild West, the arrival of sort of
even
the Virginian,
that historian at the World's Fair, or whatever. I can't think of his name, but right, this really sets the tone for how
Frederick Jackson Turner's Frontier Thesis.
Yes, thank you.
Everything is being constructed as it's still going. I mean, Into the Frontier, the same year that they pronounced that, it's the Wounded Knee Massacre. Right, so it's just like the Indian Wars are just finishing as this myth is arising. That to me is hugely fascinating because you can't have the myth without that level of mass culture that's circulating to the point where reality that is within reach dissolves into this mythical cultural history that is too exciting, too compelling to push aside for the reality that's still with them. Right. And so
it's complicated and bloody and violent.
And you get that with the gunfighter stories where where those gunfighters are kind of these pathetic individuals, and
who just have blown these stories out of proportion. And it's like their fame outstrips the qualities that they have as individuals, except for Black Belle.
Right? And she means business because she kind of has to. Right. So she has to mean business, but I think that's I mean, when we're going through the feminist ethics, and then the actual history, a game produced, less than 10 years ago, adding elements that might be perceived as a construction, but actually, on some cases points towards a more realistic, history of the past.
That's right.
At the same time, it's, there are some stuff that is really should be situated in the 70s.
Sure. Yeah.
There is something to this where, yes, there are inconsistencies in the history.
Yes.
But there's inconsistencies in the history without the game.
Yeah, that's right.
And so the game...
And a lot of those inconsistencies are sort of in service to the idea that the game is a product being sold and you want to do exciting stuff. So, would it have been that fun if you're playing the game and I don't know, maybe Arthur's not super racist, but everyone else in the gang is? It's like, that wouldn't be as fun. But when if Micah is really the only racist and everyone else is like, come on, Micah's too far, well, that feels better for us. We're more likely to play it. Right? Even though it might not have been as accurate to how people would have treated each other most of the time, many times. So, so I think, and this is also a good way to kind of tie in the game is, you certainly have a lot of traditional depictions of femininity in the game, but, Sadie is a good case where this kind of breaks, right? So, you can go into the camp at times, and the head woman of the camp, Susan, Miss Grimshaw, there are times she's berating Sadie for not kind of doing her womanly duties of cooking or cleaning or doing whatever. And then you get that mission where Sadie's like, I'm tired of this. I want to go with you. And on the way, what you hear is her basically saying, look, when we were on the frontier, this is another part of this kind of history, there just weren't a lot of people. Like me and my husband, we had to share everything. We had to do all the same work. So if he's out in the field playing, I'm out in the field playing. If he's hunting, I'm hunting or whatever, right? And this is, of course, you see this where Sadie, you say go into the general store and pick up the goods or whatever, and she pulls out a gun, and Arthur's like, no. Just go in, don't rob them, just go buy stuff or whatever. And then Sadie comes back out wearing pants and just like it's clear that, and then of course after that mission, and after, she shoots some of the, I think is it the Lemoyne Raiders?
Yeah, the Lemoyne Raiders.
When she's, after that, she's one of the people that guard the camp, right? Which is a change from her role previously. And
she begins to come into her own.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. And if you've played the game already, you know that Sadie plays an important role in the later part of the game, but you will just, she is a character that continues to sort of develop in this way, which is really interesting because it is, it does cut across traditional kind of gender norms. So, and that's, I think, a good way to think about feminist ethics, right? Is, feminist ethics, in one way you can think about it, and I don't think this is wrong. This is how I sometimes think about it, is as a competitor to these other ethical systems. And part of the reason you would think of it that way is, well, when I have two systems, if they disagree on first order matters, like how to treat a certain case or what the right thing to do in a certain case is, well, then they're giving me different answers. So it seems like they're doing the same kind of thing, which is saying, what's the right thing to do in this case, right? And so it has different sets of assumptions about what is morally relevant, whose experience is morally relevant, right? What qualities are most morally relevant. That's one way to think about feminist ethics, and I think that is an appropriate way to think about it. But another way to think about it, which Lindemann focuses on, and even Schaefer-Landau talks about, and if you read the Jagger, she talks about as well, is, another way to think about feminist ethics is it's a kind of rethinking or rejection of a lot of the basic assumptions that are common to, if not all, most of the ethical theories we've thought about in the class. And the reason for that, and this is, again, a part of feminist ethics, is a lot of these other ethical theories, they take as the sort of standard, normal, baseline experience, the experience of men, right? Or they take as the, common model for figuring out moral disagreement is maybe the marketplace or war or something. But those are going to be things that are mostly male dominated. And those are, again, broadly male experiences. Whereas for women, historically, you have a lot more experiences of taking care of dependents, of taking care of children, of taking care of, right, men that come home, taking care of elderly relatives. A lot of care work, a lot of that kind of service work, historically is done by women. And so that whole sphere of life, that what we call, quote unquote, the domestic sphere, that should be, and this is kind of a point of feminist ethics, just as much an area for moral insight and moral learning and application of moral concepts as these broader, more general kind of cases, right?
And I think too, like,
yeah, go ahead. Please.
As you're going through like that, these arguments, right? Like,
yeah.
What is it? Lindemann, when she talks about, what's on 158, the idea that, right, the debate is about power, right? So it's sort of redirecting, whether the universal is a male point of view, right? I always think of all men are created equal, right? That kind of default.
Yeah.
Or is it a woman's point of view? It also becomes just an issue of power. So it's the power that's involved in being able to determine if it's men or women.
Yeah.
And really that power to define.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're able to define,
who are the authorities, who get to set the terms of the debate, stuff like that. Yeah.
And so she writes, it's about power. Specifically, it's about the social pattern widespread across cultures and history that distributes power asymmetrically to favor men over women. And so that would be, to me, that seems like the vehicle, right? This asymmetry has been given many names, including the subjugation of women, sexism, male domination, patriarchy, systemic misogyny, phallocracy, and the oppression of women, right? And then that next, couple paragraphs down, gender doesn't just tell women to behave one way and men another. It's a power relationship. Right? And I think this is where, like, why Sadie's character is almost this invisible main character. Like you are playing Arthur. Arthur is the main character.
Yes. Yeah.
But there could be an argument that the shadow main character is Sadie, with Sadie's story almost more compelling, right, at the very beginning.
She undergoes a pretty radical transformation.
So it's a power relation, so it tells men that they're entitled to things that women aren't supposed to have. Yeah. And it tells women that they are supposed to defer to men and serve them, which is, I always think of the Grimshaw.
Yeah, some of that. Absolutely.
Her disciplining, like you need to stay in line. Yeah. We need order in the camp, and order is sort of these gendered roles.
Yeah, yeah. And so this is, I think, a good way to think about, feminist ethics. This is in Lindemann. Excuse me. This is in Lindemann as well as Schaefer-Landau. And part of this, and a thing that they both say, and if you read the Jagger, you know this too, it turns out feminist ethics is not really a single unified theory of ethics. It's more like this is a family of approaches to ethics. And you could make that same point to some extent about Kantian theory or utilitarianism, but there's more conceptual unity in them. And it's really, this is the theory, and then you might have sort of specifications or offshoots or whatever. Feminist ethics really, if you try to say, what do all feminist ethicists who write on feminist ethics have in common? You can't assume that they're all going to be care theorists. You can't assume that they all necessarily think that all other ethical theories don't work, because that's not true. But what you do have is the idea that, number one, right, they should have the same moral status and the same moral consideration as men do. And second, that women's experience matters, right, and should inform some of this discussion. And historically, it just has not been the case. And then Schaefer-Landau adds two more points. The third being, traditionally feminine traits and traditionally masculine traits, that those are things that are traditional, but they are not, constitutive or universal or necessary. So if it's a masculine trait to be loud and it's a feminine trait to be kind of meek, well, there can be meek men and loud women, right, and all of this kind of stuff. So it's not sort of, those lines are not drawn, in a really sort of hard to pass boundary. And then his fourth point, which I think would also broadly be something that most feminist ethicists would agree with, is the kind of traditionally feminine ways of sort of engaging in moral deliberation are not necessarily inferior, and in fact have something to recommend them as compared to the traditionally male ways of engaging moral reasoning. So in particular, a lot of Western ethics really focuses on what happens if someone tries to kill me or assault me or hurt me, right? Or even, what am I going to do when I'm arguing ethics with you? Well, I'm going to give you my argument, and it's like a competitor against your argument, and I'm going to show you that you're wrong or something, right? And I think the idea is, for the way that historically and currently it is very common for women to engage in moral liberation, is it's much more collaborative often. It involves trusting the viewpoint of others. It involves being sort of socially situated and particular, as opposed to abstract and true of any time and stuff like that, right? It's not universal. It's particular. It's not focused on reason the way Kant is. It also includes emotions as having a really significant role, right? And so the other thing, you could kind of imagine sometimes, if you're thinking about Kantian ethics or utilitarianism, well, this is like what a robot would do, or a Vulcan, right, Mr. Spock would do, or even like an angel, in the sense of just like a being that is not material and is perfectly rational and stuff, that ideal agent in social contract theory, right? And an insight from feminist ethics is, no, human beings are embodied with particular identities, and we should pay attention to that and not pretend like that isn't helpful and informative and important in engaging with moral deliberation. So the most common single theory is care ethics, just because that is the single most carefully worked out ethical theory, which is why Schaefer-Landau is really focused on it. But if you read the Jagger, there's lots of feminist ethicists who do not agree with care ethics and who think that's actually the wrong way to approach these things. And of course, you could think, and I think most feminist ethics would not necessarily endorse this, but there are lots of women, I think, who have broadly feminist commitments who would endorse this, that are philosophers, who would say, we actually don't need to have a radically new sense of ethics. What we need to do is we need to just correct gaps in other ethical theories. So Christine Korsgaard is a woman philosopher, and on her view, Kant just got a lot of stuff wrong, including about women, right? And so if we can patch these theories, or even think about John Stuart Mill, right? John Stuart Mill, utilitarianism is pretty clearly committed to not having sort of sexist commitments, because women are affected just as much as men, and so to deny them on the basis of their gender is just against the theory, right? So there are some people who would say you can deal with these issues about gender inequality and about the oppression of women and this history of women not having the right to vote or own property or have bodily integrity or security or whatever, by just being more careful about how we apply the other ethical theories we have. But a lot of feminist ethicists will say, no, the whole thing is kind of rotten. We need to rethink the whole thing, right? With the unique conceptual resources that women bring to the table. So,
yeah. So I think for the two chapters, Chapter 7 and Chapter 8, for Richardson, right, we're getting close to bringing this in for a landing here.
Yeah.
Right, as we move into the 1890s, which is this period that the game is situated in, you do kind of have, right, and I do, it's, I didn't really plan this. This was more necessity to push these two chapters together during this week before spring break.
Yeah.
But they work really well because as you go into the late 1880s, going into the 90s, the special interests, right, really focus on big business because for the most part, African Americans are just completely marginalized at this point, right? Jim Crow, it's not 1896 yet with Plessy versus Ferguson, but Jim Crow is largely in place where it historically is in place. And then there's informal Jim Crow in the West and the North and all these other places. So really special interests during this time become big business. And at the same time, big business they're becoming trusts. Yeah. And so they're figuring out ways to get around, if the government comes up with this, then we're gonna form this kind of relationship. So we're not doing what you're saying that legally we can't do. It's like
but we're still doing kind of what we want to do.
Yeah, what's that? The shell game, right? And so the middle class really wants to curb big business. The middle class does not necessarily like these tariffs either. Again, contemporary, we're moving into another strangely, weird echo of this time. But for, I think, American citizens understand that these tariffs are taxes on them. And that the tariffs are put in place because of the lobbying. And that's really the big sort of, quote, both parties are doing it. Like, it's, it is, that's the way the game is played. I think there's that, the one thing we were talking in class is about, senators being just appointed by the governor, which just is
so
right.
So all these, what, Standard Railroad or Standard
Yeah,
Oil?
Standard, like the famous one were the Standard Oil lawyers that would just be put in by various governors. And so, it's like, it makes things easier. They're not even, it's not even democracy. It's just political appointees. And again, I think that the part to understand is the founders had no idea that big business would be, if it was Jefferson, it's all these agrarian farmers working together as a democracy with slaves and expropriating indigenous land, but in this sort of ideal of this perfect, as he called the Empire of Liberty, it's small scale. But, obviously things don't go that way. There's concentration of wealth and big business comes, out of the Civil War, right? No one anticipated that war would create a large federal government, which is against the founders, right? Wishes. And then, but with that comes a generation of men who benefit from a large federal government and become very wealthy. And then you have the railroad and so on and so forth, things we've been talking about. This is also the moment that you have the rise of populism. So if you're in Kansas, like this is the moment Kansas is really shining in terms of political activism. Wheat prices are down in the 1880s. There's a drought. The railroad is really a thorn in the side of wheat farmers because the prices you get to transport stuff on the railroad often dissolves any profits you can make from the, and it's from their perspective, it's not fair, right? And you have these different, right? Kansas brought the National Farmers Alliance and the Southern Alliance together to form, right, a political party, which is really the Populist Party, and the Ocala Demands, right, which is a manifesto called for the abolition of national banks, an increase in paper and silver money to at least $50 per person, an end to corrupt government, which we're still trying to call for an end to corrupt government. The direct election of senators, again, and there's that key. They want to be able to elect their senators. And then regulation of railroads and even nationalization of railroads if necessary. Right. And then the last part here, this one really stuck out because of contemporary issues with housing. And the reserve of lands for, quote, actual settlers only. Right. Which.
So if you think about like the housing market now.
The housing markets.
More and more of it is bought either by private corporations or
holding companies, investment companies,
or a few people that own like 40, 50, 60, 80 properties
Yeah,
or something like that.
And so
as opposed to just those homes being dwelled in by and bought by families or individuals or people that would live in them. As a primary residence.
Yeah, so primary residence is, I think, a big, and I think some neighborhoods have, right, in their, what's that, homeowners association, which are good and bad, right? I've heard people complain, I can't paint my door yellow.
That's right. Yeah.
But there's a reason, right? You don't want some, a bunch of rich guys in New York City or Chicago buying up property and then they're just going to rent it and there's no stake.
Yeah.
Right. You want
and then
that.
You're just going to increasingly have fewer and fewer people who own their own home.
Yeah. You want the teacher and the electrician to live there and you get to know their kid and it's, community. Which again, this is, I don't like, I hate the phrase history repeats itself is dumb, right? I would just say it's dumb.
Yeah.
But there are patterns.
There are echoes.
Yeah, there's echoes. The language, right?
Yeah.
That's what I love about doing history is you hear this echo of language that updates, right? It's like it gets the software gets updated to 2.0.
That's right.
So for actual settlers owner, instead it's
for primary residents
only. The other part too is the Johnson County War in Wyoming, right? Heaven's Gate is the film you want to track down. Has all these, has Chris Christopherson as the star.
Oh, that's incredible.
Yeah, it's a controversial film because I think it's the one that bankrupt like a studio. It's
really?
I think it's the one. There's two that I always get mixed up.
Sure.
It's interesting. It's an interesting depiction of the Johnson County War. But there's labor strikes. If you hopefully got excited when you read about the Homestead strike, right? Violence between strikers and Pinkertons, right?
Yep, Pinkertons.
Pinkertons are involved.
That's right.
Miners strike in Idaho. So this is when the 90s and then the first 10, 15 years of the 20th century. Yeah. There's a lot of labor unrest in the Rockies, Pacific Northwest. You have the rise of the IWW. There's a famous
international workers of the world.
Kind of an anarchist, like the communists hated it. Like they were a thorn in the side of the communists, but then the U.S. government and corporations hated them too because they were just decentralized anarchists. There's a famous, I remember I watched, there was an old documentary from the 70s that's you can track down on YouTube that it's great because you have these people that are still alive and they're being interviewed.
That's awesome.
And they talk about like there was a conflict in Seattle and it's just open gun, like people shooting at each other back and forth. This, right, when, previously we just talked about the middle class wanting to curb big business.
Yeah.
These types of things, the rise of populism, violent strikes.
Yeah.
This
Clashes
is
of labor.
Yeah. This is all of a sudden mainstream Americans are like, we want to curb big business, but this makes us more nervous. Right. These populists make us nervous. The strikers make us nervous.
Yeah.
And that's where, you go into the 1896 campaign. And that's one of these sort of, arguably in K through 12 high school, like this is probably the most important period of that. If we want to understand contemporary politics in light of the past.
It's kind of a watershed moment.
Yeah, it's because mainstream Americans basically side with the party that is very much big business.
This is the middle class.
Yeah, so the middle class, like on the one hand, they're like, we need to curb big business. On the other hand, we don't like all these radical strikers and they're shooting back at either the National Guard or the police.
Private police forces or National Guard,
And I mean, when you think of National Guard armories, right? Like I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, so it's the armory was called the Armory, but I never really understood it as an armory in the militant sense. It's just for whatever reason, it was called that. That's where you went and saw professional wrestling.
Yeah.
Right. The cheap version of it.
Sure.
Or I saw Alice in Chains at
that's incredible.
the Salem Armory.
Yeah.
Just this
awesome.
old building we'll use it as a venue for rock bands. But the armories were created specifically during this era to house weapons. So
you crack
if there were labor unrest, National Guard would be mobilized, they'd get their weapons and then go and do their stuff. Because, right, the question is, well, what was before the National Guard? It was the militia. Mm-hmm. But what happens when the militia are the same people that are striking?
Yes. Yeah.
And so the National Guard is this weird professionalization of soldiers that are civilians, but when they're mobilized, they fall under the state.
Yeah.
Right. And that to me is another really fascinating moment in this, because it was basically an admission that if you rely on the militia, which that's the Second Amendment, right? Mm-hmm. That's really the core.
Yeah. Well-regulated militia.
We have the right to have militias. So technically, we should have militias patrolling the streets.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's a constitutional right.
Yeah.
But you can't do that if they're also the people working at the factories that are
getting upset with the
owner. Yeah. And so, and again, in that you could say that that's an expansion of government.
Yeah.
Why do you need a National Guard when the militia works fine? Mm-hmm. Right? You don't have to pay them.
Yep.
It's just a militia, right?
Yep.
So, this period is so strange, and taking a closer look at the period really makes it a lot stranger in reflection to today's rhetoric about how people see the past.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Like again, the armory. The armory to me was just something. It was just
a building.
Word.
Yeah.
It was just another.
I don't think I realized until I was like, I don't know, probably in my 20s, that the VFW wasn't just a place that people went to drink.
Yeah.
Like in my hometown, it was just one of the bars, or so that's how I thought of it. I didn't know VFW meant Veterans of Foreign Wars. I didn't know it was a place like for veterans to go and socialize and have their own space from coming back from whatever theater they'd been in. And so it's just interesting how divorced things can get from their historical context just as we're growing up around it.
It's like an Elks Club.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Like I think my dad was in the Elks Club. And I just never understood, like, what does that mean?
Yeah, that's
elk?
right.
What is that? Yeah. Is that like it's the Coors Light of masonry? Some masons, and you know what?
We're going to be elks.
You know what? This. We don't take ourselves too seriously. We're just the elks.
That's right.
We're not the masons. We're not conjuring spells.
That's
Alistair
right.
Crowley and
there's no Illuminati connection. We're not Rosicrucians.
We're not going to influence the Led Zeppelin albums.
That's right.
But there's this last paragraph here that we'll do, and then we're sort of done with chapter 8, where Richardson writes, by 1896, mainstream Americans had a clear vision of a world in which hardworking individuals could rise together, protected by an activist government that curbed business and organized labor, as well as any other group trying to harness government, and also protected the individualist family. Right? This vision, and again, we have to stress vision, it's not reality, but this vision drew from both the northern and the southern traditional views of American republicanism, filtered through the racial and industrial turmoil of the past 3 decades, right? Yeah. So Civil War, Emancipation, Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction. Yeah. Facing, and then the Indian Wars, right? Yes. Like in sort of the final, Geronimo is really the last. Facing the specter of disaffected Americans trying to control government and use it for their own benefit, mainstream Americans had come to believe that many would fail and that this was their own fault. And that they should be isolated from power before they destroyed society. And so the other part of this, right, Americans had come to believe that many would fail, and this was their own fault.
Yeah.
The ghost in this, too, is the rise of eugenics and social Darwinism.
Yeah.
Right? And that's right. I always think of this moment where we want to curb big government, but suddenly you have anarchist miners and like populists, and it's like we'll go with capital, right? Like big C, capital with a big C.
Yeah.
And with that, there's a bargain struck.
Mm-hmm.
And I really think that helps to define what happens, early 20th century, right? It is the progressive era.
Mm-hmm.
And so the irony of all this is a lot of stuff that the populists are talking about in the 1880s, 1890s is implemented with Wilson, President Wilson.
Yeah.
But that's also sort of the end. Right? World War I kind of stops a lot of this quote progress. The 20s is very much a reaction against all of that. Mm-hmm. And then there's a reason why it's the roaring 20s, and we kind of think of this as a rich time. For American farmers, they're experiencing the 1880s all over again.
Yeah.
Right? The American farmers are the first to feel the Depression before the Depression even hits.
Yeah.
And so by 28, 29...
Isn't this also, I might be getting this wrong, isn't this also like the Dust Bowl period?
Yeah, that's a part of it.
1930s?
Yeah, that's a part of it. And so by the time the Depression, the stock market crashed and the Depression, and we're in the 30s, a part of FDR's, both the victories of FDR and his struggles to get policies that he thinks will help is related back to this mainstream ideology, because on the one hand, the American mainstream wants government to work for them. Mm-hmm. But then it gets nervous when it's the wrong people that are being supported.
Helped, supported, subsidies or whatever.
And arguably FDR does a good balancing act where when he starts going after big business, it works. Right? Like, that's a button pushed. Everyone looks around and like, wait, let's see what happens. Oh, positive reaction.
Yeah.
And then we're going to go in this direction. But then there's also, and this is the part that we don't really remember with FDR or Democrats at the Democratic Party, the bargain struck in all this, right, to get big business on the side of the New Deal. Not everyone. The DuPonts don't like it.
Yeah.
But the main parts of big business, finance. Right, there's the argument is J.P. Morgan sticks with Republicans when the Depression hits, and all the other financial people move to the Democratic Party. But the bargain struck is big government, as it expands and creates the welfare state, will not go after monopolies. And that's the bargain. There's a reason why we have, even in our world today, we have a tough time going after Amazon or Google, because there's a bargain struck that's been in place for so long that, I mean, how many generations? We're 3-4 generations out from a mainstream anti-monopoly sentiment where we don't even understand what that means. To us, it's a game. Mm-hmm. Wait, monopoly is a game, right?
That's right.
Yeah. And that, again, all this kind of falls into place in the 1880s, 1890s, but right as you go with FDR, he's saddled with, it's like he's straddling this world, right? He's building off the ideas that came before, but then again, that's the Faustian
the
bargain is we're not going to go after monopolies. I mean, AT&T has broke up.
Sure.
There's a few. Standard Oil, I think, is Mobil.
Yeah.
But they're all back together now anyway. So it's like you didn't really, it only like, you have to break up for like 20, 30 years.
Yeah, that's right.
But anyway, I think, if we're looking at this as pure entertainment in terms of reading Richardson in conjunction with the book, I do like the way she brings it in for a landing, because all this stuff, it's like everything's kind of coming to a head in this.
It's really well done too. You take all these disparate historical strands and all these concerns and all these events, and then you can kind of see it coming to, right, this thing. So, no, I think that's very well done. So we usually end by talking about some weaknesses of the theory, and so I will do that very briefly. Schaefer-Landau gives us some examples. And of course, if you read your Jagger, you notice that at the end, she is quite critical of both care ethics and certain kind of assumptions about that many feminist ethicists make. But I think, if we're thinking of just sort of one or two big ones, the same way we've been doing for all of them, we haven't covered all of Schaefer-Landau's critiques or objections for all of the theories. One thing we might want to say is, there should definitely be a role for emotion in moral sensibility and moral sentiment. But, emotion can also make us act really irrationally really quickly. And I don't mean that in a coded way, right? That's like women are irrational, that's because of emotion. I mean, think about, there are people who, for example, are furious that women can vote or something, right? And so it's not like we think their fury tells them something important about the moral features of the situation. We usually think, well, they're really upset about something, but maybe that's actually why they're not thinking clearly about it or something, right? And so, if you remember our very first, one of our first readings by Tom Regan about moral reasoning, he advocated coolness, which was, when we have high states of emotion, sometimes that's not the right time to make a moral decision or to evaluate an argument. And even myself, like sometimes I will read a philosopher that I disagree with, and sometimes my disagreement is so strong it makes me angry or it makes me upset. And then I have to think, okay, I probably need to take a step back and reread this again later when I'm not feeling such high emotion. So one thing that you might want from a feminist ethic approach, which really prizes emotion as something that informs our moral sentiment and informs our moral decision, is more of an account of like what kinds of emotions help with that and what kinds of emotions are harmful, right? Another thing that you might think of here is it is certainly true in terms of an objection that sometimes feminist theorists will reject things like rights, right, or the kind of impartiality, because caring for people is partial, right? My interactions with my family is very partial. And rights are the kind of things that you might think, this is a one way to think about it. I stand on a right when I have to press it on someone who doesn't know me or who's someone who I'm competing with. And so it is true that those are kind of not particularly, feminine ways of approaching those things and not really rooted in women's experiences. But it's also the case that, sometimes impartiality, the benefit of something like that is, well, not being partial by, say, preferring your race or ethnicity or sex or gender or sexual orientation to the exclusion of others, right? Or, rights language, as our early readings noted, is one of the things that people often find very helpful when we're talking about an oppressed population is, well, those rights, they either have those rights or those rights should be extended legally to them or something like that. And so, part of this is not necessarily a critique of any form of feminist ethics. It's more, there are these broad trends, and these are things that are like, there are these trends in feminist ethics to say, emotions are, if not important, central and really important in making moral decisions and in guiding moral reasoning, or, impartiality and rights really reflect a kind of, phallocentric, male-dominated way of understanding the world. But there might also be real reasons to think that those things are more helpful or useful than some feminist theorists would say. So I think that's all we have for this week. I think a note for people in our online class, there's not really a way to quote-unquote turn Yellow Dig off. So try to comment through the break or comment on other times to make up for it, because it's going to kind of be sensing that you should be doing it. But we don't really have anything in our break that's due. So, do your reflection paper, do your other stuff. And otherwise, if you can, enjoy a nice little break.
Yeah, and make sure you're thinking about that final paper.
That's exactly right, yeah. We appreciate those of you who have posted your kind of outline on the Yellow Dig. That's really helpful. And hopefully your classmates are getting some ideas themselves, what they might do. But be thinking about that and be thinking about, using some of your reflection papers as a way to explore what's really interesting to you that you might dive into when we get to that point. So otherwise, have a great week, everyone.
Yep.
We'll see you soon.